For decades, the Philippine economy has been a real puzzle. It's a country defined by two nicknames that are complete opposites. It's a story of incredible highs and really devastating lows, and it leaves you wondering, what is the true identity of this nation's economy?
On one hand, you've got this label, the sick man of Asia. It just sounds like stagnation, like struggle. But then, on the other hand, you hear Asia's rising tiger, which paints a picture of power, energy, and just explosive growth. Now, these aren't just some catchy phrases. They represent two very real and very different chapters in the country's economic story. So which one is it? What's the real story here?
All right, so to get to the bottom of this, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the story behind these two nicknames. Then we're going to dive into the country's roller coaster economic history, look at its unique path to growth, unpack the massive disruption from the pandemic, and finally explore the path forward.
Okay, so to really understand where the Philippines is today, we have to look back. We're talking 75 years of post-independence history. And let me tell you, it's a wild ride of huge promise, deep crisis, and a really hard-won recovery. You can really break this whole history down into three distinct eras. First, right after independence, there was this period of super high hopes that kind of fizzled out into slowing growth. That was followed by a really deep and long crisis. And then finally, a period of recovery where the Philippines started to get back in the game with its dynamic neighbors in East Asia. And when I say the crisis era was severe, it was stunning. In the mid-1980s, the economy didn't just slow down, it completely crashed. Over just 2 years, 1984 and 1985, the economy shrank by a jaw-dropping 15%. That was the country's worst recession in its entire post-war history.
So what on earth caused this collapse? Well, it was basically a perfect storm. On the outside, global interest rates were going through the roof. But internally, you had these massive international loans being poured into sketchy prestige projects or just handed out to politically connected friends. This led to what the world started calling crony capitalism. You combine that with growing political chaos, and the economy just went into a total freefall.
And here's the crucial part. The 1980s became a lost decade for the Philippines. While its neighbors, countries like Thailand and Malaysia were absolutely booming, the Philippines was going backward. By 1990, the average Filipino's income was less than half of their neighbors, a huge gap that would take decades to even start closing.
Now, after hitting rock bottom, the Philippines did start to grow again. But, and this is super interesting, it happened in a very different way from its neighbors. It didn't follow that classic playbook of building up export-led manufacturing. Instead, it carved out a whole new identity based on services.
And this shift was just dramatic. If you go back to the 1970s, manufacturing was a pretty big deal, making up about 27% of the economy. Today, that's fallen to just 18%. The real story, the game changer, is the explosion of the services sector. It now generates a massive 61% of the country's GDP.
So what's powering this service economy? Well, for a long time, it was all about remittances, money sent home from Filipinos working abroad. But then, a whole new engine roared to life: business process outsourcing, or BPO. In just over a decade, BPO revenues went from being a tiny fraction of remittances to being worth almost 3/4 of them. Think about that. This is capital flowing into the country to hire its incredibly well-educated, English-speaking workforce. And this new economic model, it produced some absolutely incredible results. Before 2020, the Philippines had nearly 80 straight quarters of positive growth. That's 20 years without a single downturn. From 2010 on, it was consistently growing at over 6% a year. And here's the most important part: this growth was actually lifting people up. The poverty rate was cut almost in half. This is where that rising tiger nickname really took hold. But just as the tiger was really hitting its stride, the world was hit by a shock that nobody saw coming. The COVID-19 pandemic brought all of that incredible momentum to a screeching halt. The impact was just devastating. In 2020, the Philippine economy shrank by 9.6%. Let me put that in perspective for you. This was the single worst economic crisis the country had faced since independence. It was even worse than that crash back in the 1980s. And it wasn't just bad in isolation. The Philippines suffered the deepest recession among all of its key neighbors in the region. While a country like Vietnam somehow, incredibly, managed to grow, the Philippine economy took a historic step backward. And the damage isn't just a short-term thing. This vulnerability index is a way of measuring the potential for long-term economic scarring. And as you can see, the Philippines ranks as highly vulnerable. That suggests a really long and difficult road to recovery, all because of the deep hits to jobs, to education, and to the very structure of the economy. So, That brings us to the crucial question. What happens next? How does the country get back on its feet? Let's take a look at the key challenges and the reforms that are going to define this whole post-pandemic recovery.
So the path forward really seems to rest on 4 crucial pillars. First, you got to strengthen that solid macroeconomic management that works so well for decades. But it also means you have to tackle the areas the pandemic really exposed as weaknesses, speeding up the shift to a digital economy, transforming the health sector, and completely rebuilding the education system.
Let's just zoom in on one of those for a second, the digital divide. I mean, the pandemic made this painfully clear, right? While some of us were able to work and learn and even shop from home, millions of people without reliable internet access were just left behind. And that just made existing inequality so much worse.
A survey from 2019 found that internet access in urban areas is a full 20 percentage points higher than it is in rural areas. Just think about that. That gap is a massive barrier to opportunity for a huge part of the population.
And, closing that digital gap is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. The recovery also depends on finally tackling some of these long-standing structural problems, a restrictive foreign investment climate that has caused it to miss out on manufacturing jobs, stubbornly high inequality, an education system where the quality just isn't keeping up with its neighbors, and of course, the ever-present issues of corruption and dynastic politics.
Which brings us right back to our central question. The Philippine economy has proven it's resilient. It rose from the ashes of a lost decade to become a rising tiger. But the pandemic has dealt it a heavy, heavy blow, setting it back years. The path forward is clear, but it means tackling some really deep-seated challenges. So the question remains, can the tiger find its strength and regain its roar? Well, only time will tell.